the war that killed a superpower. On Christmas Day 1979, Soviet transport planes began landing at Kabul airport in Afghanistan. Within 72 hours, 50,000 Soviet troops had poured into the country. The Kremlin believed it could secure Afghanistan quickly and withdraw within months. They were catastrophically wrong. The war would last 10 years, kill 15,000 Soviet soldiers, and cost $50 billion that the Soviet Union did not have. That $50 billion would bankrupt the Soviet economy and trigger the collapse of the entire communist system. If you think the Soviet Union fell because communism doesn't work, what I'm about to show you will destroy that illusion. The USSR collapsed because it ran out of money. And it ran out of money because it spent a decade bleeding cash in Afghanistan while oil prices collapsed. $50 billion. That was just the direct military cost. The real damage was far worse. In 1979, the USSR was already struggling. The economy had been stagnating since the 1970s. The only thing keeping the system afloat was oil revenue. High oil prices in the 1970s had generated massive export earnings. But in the mid-1980s, oil prices collapsed from over $30 per barrel to less than $10. The Soviet economy was devastated. Government revenue collapsed. And at the exact moment when they needed every ruble to survive, they were burning billions in Afghanistan. A costly war plus collapsing oil revenue equals bankruptcy, and when a superpower goes bankrupt, it loses everything. The decision to invade was made by aging Soviet leaders who had no understanding of the economic cost. Leonid Brezhnev ignored warnings from the KGB and military that the war would be a disaster. He made a political decision without considering that the Soviet military budget, already consuming 20% of GDP, would explode. But here's what the Soviets didn't see coming. The United States would turn Afghanistan into a trap designed specifically to bleed the Soviet economy dry. The American trap. The United States saw the Soviet invasion as an opportunity to inflict maximum economic damage. The strategy was simple. Arm the Mujahideen with enough weapons to prevent a Soviet victory, but not enough to win quickly. Keep the Soviets trapped in an expensive, unwinnable war. Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, understood that the Soviet economy was fragile. He calculated that a prolonged war would force the Soviets to divert resources from their economy to their military. The CIA began funneling weapons to the Mujahideen through Pakistan. At first, the support was modest, but by the mid-1980s, the United States was spending over $500 million per year arming Afghan rebels. Stinger missiles, introduced in 1986, were devastatingly effective against Soviet helicopters. Soviet pilots, who had operated with impunity, suddenly faced constant threat. The casualty rate spiked. The cost of replacing aircraft mounted. But the real genius was economic. For every dollar the United States spent arming rebels, the Soviet Union had to spend $10 to $20 responding. The war became a financial arms race that the Soviets could not win because their economy was a fraction of the size of America. While the war bled the budget, oil prices collapsed. New production from the North Sea and non-OPEC sources flooded the market. By 1986, prices had crashed to around $10 per barrel. For the Soviet Union, this was catastrophic. Oil exports were the primary source of hard currency used to import grain, technology, and consumer goods. When oil prices fell, revenue fell with them. Between 1985 and 1988, Soviet oil export earnings dropped by more than half. The government lost billions in annual revenue at the exact moment it was spending billions on war. The budget deficit exploded. Soviet citizens began experiencing real hardship. Store shelves were empty. Basic goods like soap and sugar disappeared. Wages lost purchasing power. And the population blamed the government. The mounting costs. The $50 billion estimate almost certainly understated the true cost. Official numbers didn't include replacing equipment, pensions for wounded soldiers, subsidies to the Afghan government, or the economic cost of pulling hundreds of thousands of young men out of the workforce. Soviet forces numbered around 100,000 at peak deployment. The logistics of supplying them in a landlocked country with poor infrastructure were nightmarish. Every bullet, every can of food, every liter of fuel had to be trucked in over mountain roads under constant attack. Equipment losses were staggering. Over 150 Soviet aircraft were shot down. Thousands of armored vehicles were destroyed. The replacement cost alone ran into billions. And, unlike the United States, the Soviet Union struggled to replace military equipment while maintaining civilian production. The war exposed Soviet military weaknesses. Tactics designed for conventional war in Europe were useless in Afghan mountains. Soldiers, many poorly trained conscripts, were demoralized. Drug abuse and desertion became serious problems. The myth of Soviet military invincibility was shattered. While war consumed resources, the Soviet economy entered terminal crisis. Central planning had become sclerotic. Factories produced goods no one wanted. Televisions exploded. Cars broke down constantly. There was no market mechanism to allocate resources efficiently. The technology gap with the West had become a chasm. While American and Japanese companies developed computers and semiconductors, Soviet industry used equipment from the 1950s. The USSR was falling further behind every year. Mikhail Gorbachev, who became Soviet leader in 1985, understood the economy was collapsing. He introduced reforms called perestroika and glasnost to revive growth. But the reforms came too late. The economy continued to deteriorate. The war also destroyed Soviet international goodwill. The invasion was condemned globally. Muslim countries turned hostile. Foreign investment dried up. Western banks reduced credit lines. The USSR found itself isolated economically when it needed to integrate with global markets to modernize. Gorbachev's impossible choice. When Gorbachev took power, he inherited an economy in crisis and an unwinnable war. If he withdrew from Afghanistan, he would appear weak. If he stayed, the economic bleeding would continue. He tried a middle path. He increased military pressure, hoping for decisive victory that would allow honorable withdrawal. He sent more troops. He authorized brutal tactics. He bombed villages. Nothing worked. The Mujahideen, supplied with American weapons and supported by Pakistan, fought on. Meanwhile, the economic situation worsened. Gorbachev's reforms created chaos without improving production. Shortages intensified. The black market grew. Corruption became endemic. The population's faith in communism collapsed entirely. By 1988, Gorbachev accepted reality. The war could not be won. Continuing it would bankrupt the country. In April 1988, he announced Soviet forces would withdraw. The withdrawal was completed in February 1989. The war had lasted 10 years, killed 15,000 Soviet soldiers, and cost at least $50 billion. But the damage was done. The Soviet economy was in ruins. The political system had lost legitimacy. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of ideology. It collapsed because it ran out of money. By 1989, the government was functionally bankrupt. It could not pay its bills. It could not service debts. It could not import goods needed to keep the population fed. In 1985, the Soviet budget deficit was around 2% of GDP. By 1989, it had exploded to over 10%. The government covered the gap by printing money and borrowing. This created a vicious cycle. Printing money caused inflation. Inflation eroded wages and savings. People lost confidence in the ruble. They hoarded goods in foreign currency. This created more shortages, which required more money printing, which caused more inflation. The Soviet Union was also deeply in debt to Western banks. Total foreign debt reached over $50 billion by the late 1980s. The government struggled to make interest payments. Western creditors demanded repayment. The USSR faced sovereign debt crisis. In desperation, the Soviet government tried to borrow more, but Western banks refused new loans. The USSR was cut off from international credit. Without the ability to borrow, without oil revenue, without a functioning economy, the government had no way to pay its bills. The satellite states break away. As the Soviet economy collapsed, the satellite states in Eastern Europe saw their opportunity. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany all moved toward independence. The Soviet leadership, facing bankruptcy, could not afford military intervention. The most dramatic moment came in November 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union, which would have sent tanks a decade earlier, did nothing. It couldn't afford to do anything. The military was demoralized. The economy was collapsing. The government was bankrupt. The loss of Eastern Europe meant the loss of economic resources. The satellite states had been subsidizing the Soviet economy through forced trade. When they left, the USSR lost another revenue source when it desperately needed every ruble. By 1991, the Soviet Union was in its death spiral. The economy had contracted for 3 consecutive years. Industrial production was falling. Store shelves were empty. The currency was worthless. The government could not maintain basic services. The Baltic states declared independence. Other republics demanded autonomy. The Soviet Union, held together by military force, was fragmenting. The central government had neither money nor political will to hold it together. In August 1991, hardline communists attempted a coup. They arrested Gorbachev and declared emergency. But the coup failed within days. The military refused to fire on civilians. The Soviet system had become so weak, it couldn't even execute a successful coup. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. The red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The superpower that had challenged America for 45 years was gone, and the primary cause was economic bankruptcy triggered by the catastrophic decision to invade Afghanistan. The irony of American repetition. The irony is almost too perfect. The United States successfully used Afghanistan to bankrupt the Soviet Union. The strategy worked brilliantly. Arm the rebels, bleed the Soviets economically, watch the empire collapse. And then, in 2001, the United States invaded Afghanistan itself. Over the next 20 years, America would spend over $2 trillion fighting the exact same war in the exact same place against the exact same enemy. The economic damage to the United States has been immense. $2 trillion in Afghanistan, trillions more in Iraq. The money was borrowed, adding to national debt. And what did America get? A chaotic withdrawal, a Taliban victory, and an economy burdened with debt. The lesson should have been clear. You cannot win an asymmetric war in difficult terrain against motivated insurgency backed by external powers. The cost will always exceed any benefit. But the lesson was ignored. The $50 billion that bankrupted the Soviet Union seems small compared to modern spending. But the key is not the absolute number. It's the percentage of GDP and the health of the underlying economy. The Soviet economy was stagnant. It could not sustain even $5 billion per year. The United States, with an economy 10 times larger, could spend far more without immediate collapse. But the long-term damage is real. Trillions not spent on infrastructure, education, or healthcare. The opportunity cost compounds over decades. The Afghanistan war established a template for destroying superpowers without direct confrontation. Find a country where the superpower has interests. Arm local insurgents. Provide just enough support to prevent losing, but not enough to win quickly. Trap the superpower in an unwinnable war that drains its treasury. This strategy is being used today. The United States is using it in Ukraine, arming Ukrainian forces to bleed Russia. The pattern is clear. Proxy wars are the preferred method of great power competition. But the lesson of Soviet Afghanistan is that the country doing the bleeding can bleed out too. The United States spent $2 trillion in Afghanistan. Russia is spending billions in Ukraine while facing sanctions. No one wins these wars. Everyone just loses at different rates. The human cost behind the statistics are human lives destroyed. 15,000 Soviet soldiers died. Tens of thousands more were wounded. These soldiers returned to a country that didn't want to acknowledge the war, that had no services for veterans, that offered no support for trauma. Many turned to alcohol and drugs. Suicide rates among Afghan veterans were high. They were stigmatized by a society that saw the war as shameful failure. The Soviet government abandoned them. For Afghans, the cost was incomparably higher. Over 1 million Afghans died during Soviet occupation. Millions more became refugees. Villages were destroyed. Land was mined. The economy was shattered. When the Soviets left, civil war killed hundreds of thousands more. Afghanistan has never recovered. It remains one of the poorest countries in the world. Infrastructure was destroyed and never rebuilt. Entire generations have known nothing but war. The war also had profound psychological effects on Soviet society. The government lied from the beginning. Official media claimed Soviet forces were welcomed as liberators. They denied mounting casualties. But truth leaked out. Soldiers told families what was happening. Zinc coffins arrived in increasing numbers. The gap between propaganda and reality destroyed trust in the Soviet system. When Gorbachev introduced glasnost, allowing open discussion, the dam broke. Journalists reported honestly about casualties, failures, corruption. The Soviet people realized they had been lied to for a decade. The Soviet military was humiliated. Insurgents armed with basic weapons had fought the Red Army to a standstill. Sophisticated equipment proved vulnerable. The officer corps lost confidence. Conscript soldiers hated the war and the officers. Discipline broke down. When the Soviet Union needed its military to hold the empire together in 1989 and 1991, the military was demoralized and unwilling to fire on protesters. The Afghanistan war had broken the army's will. The final accounting, $50 billion, destroyed the Soviet Union. Not because $50 billion is enormous in absolute terms, but because it was $50 billion the USSR didn't have, spent on a war that couldn't be won when the economy was already failing. The combination was lethal. Stagnant economy, falling oil prices, rising military costs, loss of legitimacy, and a war that exposed every weakness. Any one factor might have been manageable. Together they created a cascade culminating in collapse. The Soviet Union in 1979 was a nuclear-armed state controlling half of Europe. By 1991, it had ceased to exist. The lesson is that empires are more fragile than they appear. When the economic foundation cracks, the entire structure falls. The Afghanistan war was not the only cause of collapse, but it was the catalyst. It accelerated every problem. It drained resources. It demoralized the military. It discredited the government. And it cost $50 billion that should have been spent modernizing the economy. The Soviet collapse should have been a warning. Wars of choice are fatal. If you cannot articulate clear benefit exceeding cost, don't fight. If you cannot win quickly, withdraw. If the war is bleeding your economy, end it regardless of prestige. But this lesson is never learned because the people making decisions don't pay the costs. Soviet leaders didn't fight in the mountains. They didn't pay the $50 billion. They didn't starve when shelves were empty. They were insulated from consequences until collapse consumed them. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but the cost is still being paid. Russia inherited a broken economy. Oligarchs grabbed state assets. Ordinary Russians fell into poverty. The resentment fuels Russian aggression today. For Afghanistan, the suffering continues. The Soviet invasion destroyed the country. Civil war killed hundreds of thousands. The Taliban emerged. The American invasion brought more war. The American withdrawal brought the Taliban back. Afghanistan has been at war for over 40 years. The $50 billion that bankrupted a superpower created consequences that persist today. Wars don't end when shooting stops. The damage compounds across generations. $50 billion, 10 years, 15,000 dead. One superpower destroyed. And a warning that no one heeds. The final accounting, $50 billion destroyed the Soviet Union. Not because $50 billion is enormous in absolute terms, but because it was $50 billion the USSR didn't have, spent on a war that couldn't be won when the economy was already failing. The combination was lethal: stagnant economy, falling oil prices, rising military costs, loss of legitimacy, and a war that exposed every weakness. Any one factor might have been manageable. Together they created a cascade culminating in collapse. The Soviet Union in 1979 was a nuclear-armed state controlling half of Europe. By 1991, it had ceased to exist. The lesson is that empires are more fragile than they appear. When the economic foundation cracks, the entire structure falls. The Afghanistan war was not the only cause of collapse, but it was the catalyst. It accelerated every problem. It drained resources. It demoralized the military. It discredited the government. And it cost $50 billion that should have been spent modernizing the economy. The Soviet collapse should have been a warning. Wars of choice are fatal. If you cannot articulate clear benefit exceeding cost, don't fight. If you cannot win quickly, withdraw. If the war is bleeding your economy, end it regardless of prestige. But this lesson is never learned because the people making decisions don't pay the costs. Soviet leaders didn't fight in the mountains. They didn't pay the $50 billion. They didn't starve when shelves were empty. They were insulated from consequences until collapse consumed them. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but the cost is still being paid. Russia inherited a broken economy. Oligarchs grabbed state assets. Ordinary Russians fell into poverty. The resentment fuels Russian aggression today. For Afghanistan, the suffering continues. The Soviet invasion destroyed the country. Civil war killed hundreds of thousands. The Taliban emerged. The American invasion brought more war. The American withdrawal brought the Taliban back. Afghanistan has been at war for over 40 years. The $50 billion that bankrupted a superpower created consequences that persist today. Wars don't end when shooting stops. The damage compounds across generations. $50 billion, 10 years, 15,000 dead. One superpower destroyed. And a warning that no one heeds.